Hello, coders. What is going on? I am here with a little series. I think it'll be a short playlist series depending on what kind of comments and discussions and questions I get asked. This is primarily actually aimed at students in our full stack curriculum currently, and even fresh alumni that are out there and just looking for some projects to build and things like that. I decided to make this little video series for anyone coming up in our course that's going to be using this boilerplate, which will be in the description below. It is a React front end, a Node Express backend, both using TypeScript, right? And this is a single mono repo that has both the client and the server in it, and this is the starting off point for a lot of our full stack projects. Now, if you're not a part of our course, I mean, you can get involved at the very least in our Discord by checking out the links below. But this is still going to be beneficial if you're interested in a Node Express TypeScript backend, because I'm going to show you a couple little tricks to set up this boilerplate to be a pretty solid starting point for a lot of projects. In this video, we're going to focus on just some core features in the server, some little nuances to Express that always irk me, and, you know, when I see students so far down the rabbit hole in their projects, I don't want to disrupt their flow and show them some things they should have done on their server file, for example, with middlewares and whatnot. So, you know, this one's going to be covering a different, it's going to cover several different kinds of subjects as I roll through this mini-series, right? The purpose is, how do I take this boilerplate and add it and code it so it's a very solid starter and not, as well as the name implies, as bare bones. So buckle in and let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go ahead and copy this repo. We're going to make a clone of it at the moment. I actually haven't done this step yet as of this video. It's kind of, you know, I like doing this stuff with my students. We're going to call this the solid server starter as our repository name. So we're going to clone the repo to this machine. I'm going to go ahead and, if I can type, hop into it. I'm going to sever this Git connection for now because I have accidentally pushed changes to this repo before and have had to check out and remove those changes. So I've just learned to always, you know, very dangerously RMRF that Git folder to make sure I don't push changes to that master repo by mistake, because it's oopsie, right? You'll see in the commit history several times that myself and I think my co-instructor Andrew have pushed accidental changes to the repo and then had to revert those changes. It's pretty funny. Okay, now that I got it, I'm going to npm install our base level of node modules, and I always like to do a personal test to make sure it's running the way I expect it to. So we added a post install script that will go ahead and run Webpack and compile and bundle the Express and the React code out. And we can run this little repository with nodemon for our server by running npm run dev. We got our server listening on port 3000. I personally always like to double check that it's working and running the way I expect it to, mostly because myself and our instructors here at Covalence maintain this repo, so I always like to test to make sure it works, and there you go. Hello comes from the React component. It fetches a API request to /API/hello, and it responds with the keyword world. So that's all it currently does and sets up for us at the moment. So, okay, looking good. Let's go ahead and stop this server, open up the code editor, and begin coding out what I typically do when I take students through this, or if I was going to be writing a project on this boilerplate. You know, I tell my students to play around with stuff after the course, but there is nothing wrong coming to this boilerplate because, again, it's a very, very level playing ground, if you will. It's like a very good place to test and debug features and try to figure out how to add custom things on your own by modifying Webpack and adding new rules and things like that. It's a great learning place for those kinds of things. Okay, so what I tend to do in the server is a couple of things. I mean, we know this is very bare bones. Anyone that's in our course knows the first thing they typically end up doing is adding a body parser of some kind, right? So with the newer versions of Express, y'all know that the body parser is built in, and the only reason you need it is for post and put requests. So those requests that carry some body of data require that data in a certain format, whether it's JSON or URL encoded, and you need a body parser that when you send that data to your server, it will know how to understand it. So I've seen a lot of students have both included on here, but because I intend to only use JSON data body types on my post and put requests, I only really need the Express JSON body parser above the routes itself. Now, theoretically, if I was incredibly lazy for, I don't know why, or like I was incredibly picky about where to put this body parser. As long as it's above the route where it's needed, like if this was a post route in my routes file, if this was a router.post, I could theoretically daisy chain the express JSON middleware in between here. Like I could put it here, like that as middleware. And yeah, it could theoretically just post for this one route only and parse those JSON bodies and nowhere else. But I'm not going to do that. I actually want this available on a more high level. So this is why I'm going to make my whole application use this list of middlewares, right? So we're going to kind of separate things out here. We're going to call this the list of routes. I like calling this the routes instead of API routers, since you all know that in our full stack course, we tend to have a diverging branch of API routes, which are like information and database queries and things like that, and a set of auth routes like login, register, token, verify. If you've gone into like OAuth guidelines and principles, I mean, I've delved in webinars and some of those where we talk about refresh tokens and access tokens. I like having that branching tree of API and auth folders dictating my routes, so I can just the name is very clear as to what's happening with their purpose, right? So I like doing that, but again, it's a personal choice. You don't actually have to do that. Okay, so that's why, and backing up a little bit, this is why I'm only including express.json. I'm building this project. I'm making it a one website to one server combination. It's not like I'm deploying this with the intent of having other people build websites or apps that contact this particular server or API. So that's why I always know that whenever I make a fetch request, a post or put, they're always going to have a data type, a encoding of content type application JSON. I'll never be using a form submit, and I don't mean the event like in React. If you're one of my students thinking, what do you mean by that? Remember, like on our old Node lab, I'm not going to have something in my index HTML that's as simple as like a form that had that action and that method right there. Like I'm not going to have something that looks like this. Right, I'm not going to be using form action method attributes with a button inside of the form in my input names. Like I'm not going to be doing any kind of, I think, query strings is what that ends up generating on a URL. Hence the term URL encoded. That's where that comes from. I'm never going to be doing that. I'm never going to be sending URL encoded data to the server. So that's why I'm choosing to only go with the express JSON body parsing middleware. That's all I need. Okay. With that set out of the way, y'all very well know that there's some nuances in working with a full stack application, with a single page application on its front end. We know that when we code all of our lovely TypeScript React code, it gets compiled and bundled into a JS file that simply gets sent along with our indexed HTML thanks to this express static middleware, serving up our public folder that will include all that juicy information within. That's how we wind up with this page right here. And it's a single page, right? So when we use React Router DOM on our client side, a lot of students will tend to get lost in the sauce, and they'll be confused between client-side routes and then server-side routes. If it's API or auth, it's a server-side route, and the only way we communicate with those from the client is via fetch requests, right? And then client-side routes are pretty much done by simply hitting enter on our URL bar here, but we know that comes with some nuance. To explain that, I'm going to go ahead and start coding some stuff out here. Let's add React Router DOM, something we all very commonly do in our applications, right? I mean, all of our CRUD apps in our course, like Chirper and the blog and your final project in our course, require you to have multiple views from your React page, typically all making requests to your server. So React Router DOM is a no-brainer in this case. Let's go ahead and get this running, and I'm going to show y'all the first nuance that a lot of our students have to learn out there, and then for you that aren't our students, this is just incredibly valuable information to know. Let's go to our app.tsx. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of some of these comments. I have like examples of what like a class-based component would look like with TypeScript involved. Not a big deal here. I don't have any props being passed into app. I'm actually going to go ahead and get rid of the state and use effect. I won't be needing them in this application any longer. However, I will be needing the three core components from React Router DOM v6, which are browser router, the sandwich of our whole application, our routes component, which handles all of our logic, and our route component, which is just a function that wraps our component element and has a path associated with it. These are very simple, and all the routing logic is in the routes component. I'm going to render a browser router as the sandwich of this whole thing, a routes component that will act as my old switch, if you remember what that is from the V5 router videos. And then I'll have my self-closing routes and I'll have two particular paths for this demonstration. The element is going to be simply nothing more than an h1 that says home view. Copy paste. Let's have this one be like an about page or about me page or something like that. We'll call it the about view. So we're simply rendering two simple little h1s to prove a point here, right? So is this running? It is. Okay, it's compiled, it's clean, it's good to go. So if I refresh the browser, bada bing, bada boom, my home page is showing a home view. That's what I expect to see. Now, without clicking a link, what ends up happening? Remember, when you hit enter on a URL bar, that is triggering a GET request to a server to see what happens. And our server is the Express server, not anything on our React client side. There's nothing running there. Remember, our React client side by this point in the process in the browser is a compiled and bundled JS file. And in our bare bones boilerplate, there's no code splitting, there's nothing crazy. It just sent one big fat JavaScript bundle. So if I hit /about and try and hit enter, what ends up happening is the classic conundrum, which is cannot get /about. I've seen this response a bajillion and a half times, a more billion times, if you will. So, I know exactly what this is, but if you're, a fresh student, a fresh alumni, a curious YouTuber, this is the default response from the Express server. It will code a very simple HTML page that simply says with some text that says cannot method, which will be get from the URL bar, that's a GET request, to the path we're looking for on our server. I don't have a /about coded on my server, right? And that's why this request ends up 404ing as an error and giving us this as the response in the browser. I don't want that. I want it to load my about component. So a lot of the times in our course, this typically happens either in TypeScript Chirper or even in full stack Chirper, where students are like, wait a minute, something's off here. How am I going to tell my server to step out of the way so it can load the appropriate component code? This should trigger the index.html and its fat JavaScript bundle with all the React code inside of it to simply look at the URL bar, look at its set of routes and go, oh, /about, I know what component to load. It's an h1 that says about view. That's what should happen, not the server going, let me get that for you, buddy. You're like, no, server, bro. If it's this about page, I got it, dog. I got it. That's what we're trying to do here in so many words. I just accidentally fat-clicked Postman because I'm an idiot, but we're going to be using it eventually anyway, so I'll go ahead and leave it open. Hey, nothing like an accident that actually helps me out in the long run. Postman, for those of you that aren't part of our course, is an API testing tool. I underutilize it. My co-instructor and beautiful dude Andrew has a couple of videos on our YouTube channel, and make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, about using Postman, and I keep on pushing him to make more Postman videos because there's a lot of cool features that you can use with it out there. We're going to be using it very, very Unga Bunga style. We're going to be smashing our fists into the keyboard and testing some routes here, right? That's all we're going to be doing in Postman. So I have it installed. There's actually an in-browser version. I forget what it's called these days. I think it's called like Scotch something. I can't quite remember. But nevertheless, whatever API testing tool you have, whether it's a downloaded executable on your machine or an in-browser version. If you have an in-browser version, you'll actually need an additional piece of middleware, which is called cores. We don't need that here because I'm not building another website or web app at a different location to talk to the server. This server is meant to be retrieved and accessed by this one singular client I'm coding here, which is in the same port and location as the server itself, which means cores is not required. Okay. Now, what I teach students in the webinar and what Andrew teaches them as well is there's actually a clever little trick and a nuance of working with the full stack application that has both client-side routing and server-side routing, and this is the trick here. We are basically going to build some kind of catcher's mitt that says, hey, if the server doesn't match this request, let's just bounce it back to the client and see if browser router and routes and React router DOM, if that whole kit and caboodle can handle it instead. Maybe we have a 404 page handler on our browser router or something like that. Let's check it out. We're going to build that catcher's mitt. Like I had said, when you hit enter in your URL bar, that is triggering a GET request. So we can actually do something akin to this. And let's just do a send that says wow, right? So the asterisk is called the wildcard operator, and it acts in such that if it matches any path on the method of get. But you're wondering, wouldn't that interrupt my request to /API/hello, which is the default, currently coded request onto this server? And the answer is no, because these things will match in order of top to bottom. I do top to bottom because technically routes goes into a separate file, and this is considered the top, and then it gets out of routes and down to this, which is considered the bottom part, right? That's how the matching process works. It tries to match from top to bottom, just like you learn in the browser router lectures of this course. Not this particular course, but our course. Yes. So if it doesn't happen to match API/hello or anything else in routes, anything with API or auth in our full stack projects, then this asterisk wildcard says, I got it, as long as it's a GET request. So this will not interfere with post, put, and delete requests, only GET requests. So if I simply refresh the browser to trigger another GET request to this path, we now notice that the default response of that cannot get /about is now our wow send instead. Very cool. But how about this? Let's go ahead and bring in that right there. And this is something I've been doing more and more recently. I don't know if it's either out of laziness or I tend to deal with libraries that handle their exports a little bit differently. These are TypeScript style imports. You can actually configure them in your TS server by going here and, oh, what was it? I do this all the time, forgets what it's called. Goodness me, what was it called? What am I missing here? If you're wondering what I'm talking about, there's actually like an option you can put in your TS config that I'm completely blanking out since I'm on the spot. That's what it was. It was ES module interpolable. It is a boolean that defaults to false, but if you turn it to true, it allows us to ditch these asterisk as imports and simply treat them as default imports like that, and we don't have to do an asterisk as TypeScript style import. That's a little configuration you can put on your server and client if you want JSON TS config files to make your imports look a little bit more clean or more consistent, because some libraries will do asterisk as while others won't. So I personally like ditching the asterisk as because I use it for other things like importing several objects or functions as once as an alias. We can get into that in another video. If y'all have questions about that, please let me know. But what I was trying to say before I got sidetracked with this ES module interop is that I will import path here, which is a core node module built into node for us, and path allows me to, make a directory path that will scale between my whatever architecture I'm on, whether I'm deploying to Heroku, which will no longer have free deployments, I think in September, October, ripperonis, that sucks so bad, or anywhere else. Or if I'm trying to help a student with a project, I want to make sure that when I reference the path to their public folder, it's not having to worry about their hard drive architecture also having I know there's errors happening, that's fine for right now. Having an architecture of Covalence, helping students, solid server starter. I don't want to have to worry about that, and path lets us get around that problem, right? So what is that error actually? No, there is no error. Okay, it compiled. That was the previous npm run dev before Webpack had a chance to compile and rebuild. Because I was like, there's currently no error after I remove those asterisk as. Which, by the way, if you add this boolean to true, it will break your project on your server until you remove all asterisk as references. And I was wondering why that was occurring because I removed it because it was saying I don't know what that export is, but it recompiled and bundled just fine. So there we go. Okay, what I've been trying to say here this whole time. We'll have some server globals, and I'll say like const. We'll call it the public path is going to be a path.join of underscore dir name. And remember, if we're trying to find that public folder, it is not .. out of server, .. out of source public. Like it is not this, because remember, it is not actually running from our source code. After it's compiled and bundled, our server is running from this dist folder, which means it's only up one out of dist to find that public folder to resend that as a file. Now that I have that public path set up, I can come down here and swap this from send to a send file like so, and simply say send that public path when the time comes to make that GET request. So now with that one little change up after all that rambling, voila, we have now told Express to stay out of the way on GET requests that it can't quite match, and instead send our index HTML with the coded app.js bundle, which should kick on browser router to do its job, watch the URL bar for its location, and path match, and then load the appropriate element from the appropriate route in our app. And there you go. That's a big nuance that tends to get lost in the sauce if you're not careful. I can go ahead and do some sick shorthand here like I like to do. And that sets me up with a pretty good looking little server right there. Okay. Now, we can take this a step further, and I recommend y'all do for this particular demo and walkthrough, because this is what I always do on my servers. It might make sense that if I have an API/hello, this should respond with world, which it does, thankfully. So this is my one API route on this project currently, as of cloning it and running it. But let's say I have a typo here, like hello with a Z for some reason. We see that it sends what? Technically nothing. Now, that's not what it sent. We did actually 404 on the server, right? We technically did not make an appropriate GET request to our API router. But remember what we just coded. We coded a GET catcher's mitt, I think I had the analogy for it, that said, hey, if it's a GET request that we can't match, let's just send the HTML page and see what happens. I don't have any kind of 404 handling on my React code at the moment. I don't have anything like that. But this is not even going to be a route for a component, right? This is an API route. I should have some kind of error handling middleware that my server can send a consistent response to. Like, I don't want to have to worry about going to Postman and writing this. Let's check this out. If I go to Postman and make this request by localhost 3000 API hello is a typo, I get the index HTML page as the response to that request. Now, this is not very good for error handling on my server, and it looks very, very clunky, and you'll wind up with a host of additional errors when you make a fetch request and you try and run a response.json promise on the request body when the request body is not JSON and it's an HTML page. This is bad, right? This is technically should not be a 200 OK. It should be a 404 not found request error. So we have a couple ways to handle this. I could head to my routes and code another get catcher that's /API / to handle those, but there's actually a cooler way we can do so. So watch this. I can do the following. I can make an array of what routes are currently on my client and let the client handle these two, and anything else we can handle some other way. So we can provide an array of paths to match to our routes, which is something that tends to blow students' minds the first time they learn that. That's all there is to it. Let's even go add a third route into our React code here. Let's add one for, let's say there is an FAQ page. FAQ page. And we're going to go and add it here in our client routes. It's the only caveat to doing this technique is that you'll probably forget one route and then the whole thing may come crashing down, but it's a matter of just remembering which one you forgot and adding it to those client routes. Now that I have that, check this out. If I do API hellos, we go back to the default Express 404 page, which I still don't like, but we'll deal with it in a minute. I can do the home page. I can do the FAQ page. And I can do the about page, and it recognizes all those. But once I type a path that's no longer matched by one of those three, the server kicks back on and starts error handling as it should. So with our example back here with API hellos, this was the response, this HTML page that's, with a React bundle on there. That doesn't make sense. Instead, I can go back to it actually recognizing it as a 404 not found error, and as you can see, it sends still an HTML page as the response. But if I'm building like a modern REST API, then everything should be responding from my server as a JSON response, right? I would like to see a JSON object that says error with this message maybe inside of it, right? So I still don't like this response, and that is actually the purpose of this meandering 24 already minute video of how can I enable some global error handling on my REST API. Hence why I'm calling this a solid server starter series, right? So these are two cool things that you already kind of pseudo know if you attended our webinars as a student. If you're here on YouTube, hopefully this is something new and elucidating to you, or maybe gave you a new perspective on things. There's something else that we can also do that's quite nifty. I always like to do the following. If it is not matched by the client routes, I would love to have a handler that specifically takes care of 404s. Rather than it sending this pre-coded HTML page, I would rather it set up a new error message and then send that to an error handler. So we can actually do that by the following. app.use rec res next function, which is criminally underutilized by students from our full stack course, but that's okay. Once you figure out how it works in my auth sections, it's typically not too bad. It just means go to the next step, right? Which would mean this would be step 1, and it probably calls next and goes to this. If nothing happens, it sends it to the next step, etc. That's how middlewares work. But check this out. What I like to do, bada bing, bada boom, is one of these. We can say rec.method on the request original URL not found. I'm basically setting up a custom simple message that says the method, whether it's get, post, put, or delete, on the path, like /API/hellos, just like this is currently telling us. I'm basically setting up this little message, a similar looking message to this right here. It's going to say method to this path not found. And if I see that error message, I know it's a 404. And I also know that it should be responding with JSON and not this HTML page. So we're currently coding the step that will handle that problem. Now, errors by themselves do not have some property called status, right? They don't have that, and then I'm not sure what VS Code will do, but I know our compiler is not going to be happy of me saying use this error of status number 404 and then daisy chain this error to the next step, which will be our global error handler that I'll be coding out here in a moment, right? So we're taking the error and simply sending it along to the next step, which will end up being our global error handler, like that. That's the whole goal here. So let's see. Yeah, it's not happy with me because, well, error objects don't have a property called status. So we can actually use some TypeScript shenanigans here. We can say interface, we can call it like the status error interface extends what error currently does and happens to add optionally a number property called status, right? And that way our compiler will be happy once I tell it that that's what this is. So I'll say treat this as if it was a status error, and there we go. And our compiler will now be happy with no errors. So like ignore this, that's the previous compile. This is the new compile, and it recognizes that it's like, okay, your types make sense, buddy. Error status should be a thing. We can confirm as well by hitting error dot and checking out status is right there. So now we have TypeScript understanding what error status happens to be. It means this is the status of the code 404. So you could send a code from your other endpoints like 500 and it won't use those if it's not a 404 handler, right? Now for the global error handling part, because just this doesn't do anything for us quite yet. But for our global error handling, we can say app.use. Now, TypeScript express types won't recognize this, so I'll have to add the types manually, but there is an error handler built into express functions. If I do error rec res next, that is an appropriate error handling middleware meant for this application, but as you can see, it's not happy about the types. So I will say this error is a status error, this request is an express.request, this response is of type from express.response, and this next is a express.nextFunction type. And there we go. That's how your types are going to end up lining up there. And for the actual code itself, might as well go ahead and console log what the error message happens to be, or the full error object if you like looking at all that. If I see what the error message is, I know it's enough. Or if you have like some kind of logging middleware, that'll make for a good video of how to like do some error logs on your server that help both in development and production. But for now, we're going to just console log the error message, or the error object. It's up to you. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to set up the status of the response here since we're setting it up. Now, remember, res.status doesn't send the status code. It sets a status code, and it doesn't actually send a response quite yet. It's like we're setting things up. Use the error status, if it exists, Otherwise, default to 500. We'll assume it's a 500 error. So meaning if it gets to our global error handler and we haven't sent it with a status code of like 401 or 403 or something like that, or 404 like up here, it will use those. But if it doesn't see a status on the error by the time it gets here, it'll default to a 500 error. And then from there, let's just send our res JSON error. I just want to see the error message in my response. I don't need like a full stack or something like that for my error objects, but that's it. I simply needed to handle that information right there and send that error message to me and use whatever status code is daisy chained to this point. And that right there, folks, is a global error handler and a 404 handler working in tandem that after your client routes are missed, these will pick up the slack and from there. So what has this done for us? Well, from this dumb 404 HTML page, we have a much more modern feeling response, which is a JSON response object. That's going to be very useful for handling errors on the front end as well, by the way. If you're trying to do some like re-navigating based on your fetch requests, either getting good responses or bad responses, and looking what the error message is for redirects and stuff like that, it's pretty cool to know how to do that. So now we have global error handling available on our app. What does that mean for you, the student that's here, or you, the YouTuber, right? Check this out. All of my students will have typically their routes that look like this, since we do a lot of that right there. And a lot of the times they'll copy me and they'll log messages like, they'll log what the error is just so they could take a look at it. And then they'll also set a status code of 500 and then send a JSON message of like, my code sucks, like that. And so if they saw that in Postman, they would head to their console logs and check out what that 500 status code error was. It's very common for the students from the course to kind of follow this and have this be the same in every single route, which is fine. But now that we have a global error handler, if I have an error that happens, all I have to do is now include that next function on all of my routes and simply call next error. It will then kind of toss that next error through my 404 handler if it's not found, but it's not, so it comes down to the global error handler, and then this will console log, set a status code, or use what's given, and then, yeah, it'll then log or send an error message as a response in a consistent fashion, right? That's the important part about it. There's no error happening right now, so before we send that, let's do a throw new error. Wow, cool. Next does its job well. That next function does its job well. Let's see if it works. Well, that's the 404. What happens if I do an API hello, throws a new error? Check it out. It daisy chained that error correctly, defaulted to a status code of 500 because it claims that something went wrong on the server, and it logged that error message down here for me as well to take a look at. That's pretty dang cool, right? So we can also do something like, that's fine. Yeah, you know, that's something that'll be very, very easy to utilize in all of your endpoints. Like all of your endpoints will have a try catch block with next error inside of it. Try running your query, and then all of your code is that much cleaner for it. So this server is already getting a wee bit messy. I'm going to move this port up to my globals up here because it makes kind of sense to keep them up there like that. I like kind of keeping my global variables grouped up the top if I can help it. Yeah, that's pretty dang cool. Other cool things to know how to do, I like to do this a lot on my servers as well, is make a Middlewares folder where I can set up like error handlers.mw.ts. You can actually add that extra extension in there for just a naming convention. It's not going to break anything as long as the very end extension is okay, which is ts. If I see something ending in .mw, I know they're middlewares. It's a personal pattern you can pick up, but you're like, Luke, it's already in a middlewares folder. Wouldn't the path give that away? I'm like, yeah, sure. Again, it's a preference thing. Well, who cares, right? Preference. That's what it's all about. Just pick something for a particular project and work with it. So check this out. Remember, these are just functions at the end of the day, so I can cut this out. Export const. We'll call this the not found handler as our function name. There we go. Here I'll have to add express.request, express.response, and express.next function. There we go. So there is that function being exported out. It needs to know what status error is as well. So let's just cut and paste status error over here like so. Bada bing, bada boom. And let's go ahead and set up export const, our global error handler, like that. And there is the function code. Cut it, paste it, and voila. We now have our two error handling middlewares sequestered to one little neat file, which we can then replace these here with an import statement to simply say import from our middlewares folder, error handlers middleware file. I need the not found handler, please, and I need the global error handler. And now all I have to do is say like that. And then I can even go ahead and like clean up my comments a bit and say these are my error handlers. And voila, our server is that much cleaner for it. Haha. Yeah, other personal tips I'll be getting into in later videos. I think 35 minutes is enough for a singular server-side video. I know this is not nearly as fun as like React and client-side stuff, unless you're a dork like me and other people that like server stuff. No offense, server people, we're dorks, let's be real. This is some pretty cool knowledge and a really good starting point to have on your servers. Like, the only other thing I'll have in this video is I always include the following. Morgan is an express route logging middleware. I like using it in conjunction with a logging middleware I can teach you all about later. Let's get this sucker back up and running. Here we go. And I'm going to go ahead and import that thing as well. Import Morgan from Morgan. And then I like to include it. I don't really care about logging my express static middleware responses, so I will say use the Morgan middleware with the keyword string of dev. There's actually combine and a few other strings. Dev is the nice, clean, simple version to read. I like to include that Morgan middleware always on my projects just because I really like seeing the routes that are being hit by my components. Sometimes it helps me debug problems. What I mean by that is if I make API hellos and then hellos 404, and then, hit it a couple more times, go back to hello, hit it a couple more times, and we go to our logs here. Here's what Morgan does. It gives us a beautiful collection of logs of what's happening on our server, right? And you're wondering, well, technically our console log happening from our 404 handler is the same thing that Morgan does. Yeah, a lot of the times I'll send Morgan to either a database or some kind of log text file so I can just see what requests are being made, and I still leave my console log in for development stuff. Or a lot of the times if I go to production, I remove console logs since they tend to slow things. They can be blocking and slow things down. But I think that's enough for this video. It was a pretty cool and very solid starting point on getting ready with error handlers on your server to make it feel more consistent, being very clear about what your client routes are going to be so all of your React components can work the way they need to. And then if you happen to get a 404 API error, you will get the appropriate error handling response sent via a JSON object and not as an HTML page. It makes your REST API that we code in this course in our labs and our capstone projects feel more consistent. And it's something that I do on pretty much all of my projects. I hope you all enjoyed this. If you have more questions, leave them in the comments below. Get involved in our Discord server where you can ask questions about this or learn more from us if you want to just engage in discussion. I love talking about server-side stuff, and I know there's like a hunger for it on YouTube here and people looking for server-side information because, well, there's really not like a set standard way of doing stuff. I tell my students that REST APIs aren't a rule book. They're more of a set of guidelines that tend to get broken or bent over time. So yeah, if you want more, let me know. This series will continue in the next video where I will just kind of continue building up some solid starting points on any project I would use on this boilerplate. So remember to like, comment, subscribe, and talk to y'all later.